And with that, again, I would like to welcome everyone to tonight's Los Angeles Birders webinar. Uh, Los Angeles Birders webinar. Thank you for your membership. If you are a member, we really appreciate it, and your funds come in very handy for helping to sponsor things like putting on these webinars. They help sponsor local field ornithology and community science projects, as well as lots of wonderful other things. So we really, really appreciate it. Plus, membership isn't too expensive. It's only $20 a year. Pretty good deal for everything you get. One of the great benefits you get is you get first choice into our field trips. And field trips lately have been filling up only by lab members. We haven't had a chance to open it up to the general public. So if you want first chance to some of those field trips, join lab. It's a wonderful thing to do. And with that, I would like to introduce Susan Gilliland, who will introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Susan.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Well, Los Angeles Birders is very pleased to have Dr. Olivia Sanderfoot with us tonight. Dr. Sanderfoot is currently a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UCLA, where she studies the impacts of wildfire smoke on birds in California. Olivia's work involves assessing the potential for wildlife smoke to act as an ecological disturbance and identify which birds may be most vulnerable to smoke in a rapidly warming world. Before moving to Los Angeles, Olivia completed her PhD in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle, where she studied the effects of urban air pollution and wildfire smoke on the health, behavior, and detection of birds and other wildlife. Olivia received her Bachelor of Science and her master's degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2015 and 2017, respectively. Olivia says she's driven by her passion for environmental policy and conservation, her love for birds, and her strong belief in the Wisconsin idea, the philosophy that a university's research should be applied to solve problems and improve the health, well-being, and environment of the community it serves. So without further ado, please give a hearty welcome to Olivia Sanderfoot.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I am so excited to be here. Let me get my screen up and running for you all. Close that. All right. Can someone confirm that they can see my slide?
Yeah, it looks great.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for that introduction. I'm excited to be here and share more about my research on smoke impacts on birds. I would like to open my presentation by respectfully acknowledging that I am on the traditional land of the Gabrielino Tongva people who have stewarded the land where I live and work for thousands of years. I would also like to acknowledge that my research includes studies of birds and other wildlife in and beyond California on lands that intersect with hundreds of unceded indigenous territories. This land acknowledgement is one small act in the ongoing process of reconciliation and sustainable, just management of these lands and the resources they provide. Today, I will be discussing the impacts of smoke on birds and other wildlife. We'll start with an overview of wildfire regimes in the American West and subsequent large-scale smoke events, and then move into documented impacts of wildfire smoke on avian health and behavior. After that, we'll get into my research, which focuses on analyzing how exposure to wildfire smoke ultimately influences our ability to detect birds in the field. And then I'll highlight some of the future directions I hope to take as a postdoctoral scholar at UCLA. As we all know, animals, including birds, face myriad threats, including habitat loss from urbanization and climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, human-wildlife conflict, and pollution of soil and waterways. Air pollution is also a known risk to wildlife. Air pollution makes us sick, and it makes animals sick too. But air quality to date has often been overlooked in conservation biology and wildlife management. I am particularly interested in the impacts of fine particulate matter on birds. Fine particulate matter is a class of air pollutants, commonly referred to as PM 2.5, that includes all suspended liquid and solid particles that are smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter. That's smaller than the width of a human hair. So we're talking about really tiny, fine, solid and liquid particles that are suspended in the air. And the reason why these are so dangerous is because they can become deeply embedded in the respiratory system upon inhalation. There are both biogenic and anthropogenic sources of this pollutant. Biogenic sources are natural sources, such as wind-blown dust and sea spray, whereas anthropogenic sources come from human activity. So, for example, vehicle exhaust and industrial emissions are two big factors contributing to PM 2.5 in cities. PM 2.5 poses a to public health and has been linked to cardiovascular and respiratory disease. In fact, 4.2 million premature deaths every year globally are linked to chronic exposure to PM 2.5. Because PM 2.5 is a pollutant of global concern, there are many resources available to quantify exposure, including measurements from ground-based monitors and satellite instruments, as well as estimates from air quality models, all of which also provide rich sources of data for studies of wildlife. PM 2.5 is also a major component of wildfire smoke. Many ecosystems in California, including ecosystems here in Los Angeles County, are prone to fire. From chaparral and the rain shadow of the Sierras to high elevation conifer forests, the ecosystems that we love and the birds that we enjoy are really shaped by fire. Smoke from wildland fires can travel hundreds of miles, which degrades air quality across vast geographic scales. And it's really unclear what impacts this has on birds. That said, wildfires are not new. Fossils reveal that wildfires started soon after the first terrestrial plants emerged, which was 420 million years ago. And in the Permian period, which was roughly 229 to 251 million years ago, the atmospheric concentration of oxygen was so high that even super moist vegetation was highly flammable. So even though we hear a lot about wildfires in the news these days, and with good reason, it's important to remember that wildfires, and therefore smoke, are not new phenomena for birds and other wildlife. And in fact, plants and animals have lived and evolved alongside fire since their very beginning. Yet, contrary to what Billy Joel might have to say about this, sometimes we as humans actually do start the fire. The story of fire on Earth is intimately tied to the history of humankind. Early humans living in landscapes prone to fire, such as savannas and grasslands, directly observed the power of fire to destroy and create, and harnessed that into vegetation management. Tens of thousands of years ago, hunter-gatherers were already using fire to actively manage vegetation. Today, we continue to shape the occurrence, extent, severity, and impact of fire. For example, slash and burn agriculture is a common practice used to convert forests to cropland. When used responsibly and at a small scale, such as practiced traditionally by indigenous communities for millennia, this approach to farming is sustainable, and cleared forests can recover with time. However, modern slash and burn agriculture is often practiced at a much larger scale, which has resulted in habitat fragmentation, which in turn limits ecosystem resiliency. It makes it harder for forests to bounce back when they burn. And furthermore, this type of farming actually leads to a buildup of burn materials in the areas that are cleared, and that can fuel hotter, fast-moving fires that are difficult to control. Another example is maybe closer to home for many of us, 4th of July fireworks. In the Western US, where we live, about half of all fires are started by human activity, including campfires, lit cigarettes, or fireworks. And between 1992 and 2015, more than 7,000 wildfires were started in the United States on the 4th of July alone. So as much fun as fireworks are, and who doesn't love a good fireworks show, we do need to be very careful with our fireworks and firecrackers and these other celebratory things, because sometimes they can lead to uncontrollable wildfires. Finally, it's worth thinking about the intersection between suburban sprawl and fire regimes. Suburban sprawl and fire suppression have influenced fire regimes in the Western US for several decades. Following European colonization and westward expansion, developed areas have increasingly taken over wilderness. And so even in areas where fire has historically been a frequent occurrence, we're taking over more land and we're converting more natural landscapes to built environments. And so when we do that, we end up suppressing fire in order to protect lives and property in these exurban and urban environments. Fire for many, many decades, especially in the United States, increasingly viewed as something to be avoided, and policies were established even at the level of the federal government to suppress fire activity. So this has led to a buildup of fuels that essentially act as tinder. Our forests are just full of vegetation that maybe would have naturally burned and gotten cleared out by fires, but we didn't allow those fires to take place. So that tinder is just sitting there ready to go up in flame as soon as a spark is lit. So between climate change, which is leading to increased global temperatures and drought conditions, and this legacy of fire suppression, we're seeing an increased frequency, intensity, and severity of fires. And this means that we're also seeing larger, more fast-moving megafires, which are usually defined as those greater than 10,000 acres. These are the kinds of fires that make us nervous because we're not sure how forests and other ecosystems will bounce back and recover when so much damage is done. We're also seeing fire in places that were once free of flames, and this is true for smoke too. In the age of megafires, we are going to observe more extreme smoke events, and to visualize what this might look like, you only have to think back to the devastating 2020 fire season in California and all along the West Coast for days, weeks, even months. Shown here on this slide is a true color satellite image taken on September 9th, 2020, when smoke from fires in Washington, Oregon, and California, which are marked as orange dots, swirled into this massive plume of smoke that extended from the coast out above the Pacific Ocean. We can literally see this smoke from space, and we see that it's one huge event. So think about how we felt when we were exposed to this smoke, and then consider what this could mean for wildlife that are less likely able to seek shelter during such an event. Just like us, wildlife are impacted by wildfire smoke, and we can see in these snapshots from camera traps that my team deployed in Eastern Washington that animals are exposed to smoke just like we are. And even if they live in fire-prone areas, they're still vulnerable to smoke inhalation. Animals that live in areas that have evolved with fire likely have adapted traits that allow them to detect, escape, and avoid fire. And many species also rely on habitats and resources created by fire, such as the black-backed woodpecker that builds nesting cavities in fire-killed trees. But even those animals that have evolved with fire forever are vulnerable to negative health outcomes associated with smoke inhalation. And those effects are likely to be more extreme due to extreme smoke from megafire. Furthermore, megafires are driving smoke into areas that rarely, if ever, burn, and that presents a novel threat to both people and wildlife. So to protect wildlife under future climate change scenarios, I argue that we need to start considering the impacts of wildfire smoke on birds and other animals. So to help guide future study and conservation actions, as part of my dissertation, I led a comprehensive literature review to identify and synthesize research to date on the effects of wildfire smoke on the health and behavior of wildlife. And the study has really set the stage for both exploratory and hypothesis-driven research on wildlife responses to smoke. So for this review, we started by executing a systematic search for literature using a global citation database called Web of Science. This flowchart shown here outlines the methods we used, beginning with a keyword search and ending with a full text review. So we started with keyword searches that were very broad, such as wildfire and smoke, and then we reviewed the titles and abstracts of relevant papers until we narrowed down a list of studies to just those that were most relevant to this question of how does wildfire smoke impact the health and behavior of animals. We then sorted relevant papers into 3 categories, including experiments using animal models, case studies from veterinary medicine, and studies of wildlife species. And while we incorporated knowledge gained across all 3 of these approaches, we really focused our review on that final category, studies of wildlife species. We only found 41 studies on the effects of wildfire smoke on the health and behavior of wildlife, which is really not very many. This bar plot shows the distributions of those papers that are cited in the review, and we broke down the citations by taxa and research approach. So each column here shows the results, the number of papers found for 1 of 4 taxa, including mammals, birds, reptiles, and insects. And then the papers are color-coded by general research approach, where purple refers to controlled studies and orange refers to in situ or in place studies. These are places where animals were exposed to real-world smoke conditions. We found that just 5 papers had considered the impacts of wildfire smoke on the health or behavior of birds, and no studies have been conducted on how smoke affects amphibians. Now, since publishing this review, which came out last year, 3 additional papers have been published that present or discuss effects of smoke on birds observed during the 2020 fire season, which is really exciting. But that's not adding a lot to what was already a very small number of papers. So we have a lot of work to do. Furthermore, these papers are also unevenly distributed across geographic regions. This is a world map of fire carbon emissions overlaid with locations of the studies we identified in that literature review. Those are marked with the blue dots and teal diamonds. We found that in many places prone to fire, such as several ecosystems in South America, little to no research has been conducted on the effects of wildfire smoke on wildlife. There are broad swaths of the planet where these studies have never been conducted. Despite the fact that we don't have a lot to go on, we can conclude some important things about how wildfire smoke is influencing the health and behavior of birds and other wildlife. And we can establish that animals are clearly vulnerable to both acute and chronic health outcomes as a result of smoke inhalation. So first, just like with people, when animals are exposed to smoke inhalation, what we might be most worried about in the immediate moment of that exposure is carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide is a gaseous pollutant that is found in smoke. And when carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin, which is a protein molecule that carries oxygen throughout our body, that actually results in lower blood oxygen levels because oxygen transport is limited. Essentially, you have this protein in your bloodstream. It contains iron, which gives, blood that classic color, and it helps move oxygen through your body. Without it, we wouldn't have that mechanism in place. And when carbon monoxide exposure occurs, the capacity of hemoglobin to carry oxygen is reduced, which lowers blood oxygen levels. And that can lead to damage to tissues and organs, and ultimately, if not fixed, it can lead to death. So we're worried about that. That's why we have carbon monoxide detectors in our home. Exposure to smoke can also cause both thermal and chemical damage to lung tissue, which can lead to respiratory distress. Essentially, it damages the lungs and makes it harder to breathe. There are also toxins in smoke that destroy antioxidants. Antioxidants are substances that neutralize free radicals. And I know this is a lot of biology, so hang with me. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them at the end or interrupt me if you'd like. I'm happy to take questions to make sure everyone understands the takeaways from this slide. So we have in our body these highly reactive oxygen-containing compounds that are called free radicals. And as they move around and bump into cells, they cause damage. They damage cells and tissue. But we also can either increase our consumption of or produce more antioxidants, and those substances come in and neutralize the free radicals. Unfortunately, toxins in smoke destroy that antioxidative power, and that exposes our body to this greater risk from free radicals, which is called oxidative stress. And this ultimately can impair the immune response and make us sick. Finally, studies have also shown that exposure to smoke can weaken the immune system. So for example, we have these super cool cells in our body, white blood cells called macrophages, that literally scoop up particles that we inhale and get rid of them for us, which is very cool. That's very nice of them and super helpful. But unfortunately, studies have shown that when macrophages are responsible for engulfing and digesting particulates and wildfire smoke, they can't necessarily destroy that material. So they're ineffective beyond that point. And that limits our ability to clear debris and pathogens from our lungs that can make us sick. So someone has asked if I can put, oh, sorry, that's from Ron. Okay, great. Yes, please put Q&A questions in the chat or interrupt me if you'd like. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Okay, so really what we're getting at here is even though we have very few studies on wildfire smoke impacts on birds and other wildlife, we have enough information to show that smoke inhalation is clearly going to lead to acute and chronic health outcomes. And now we need to start quantifying those in wildlife populations. I also think it's worth pointing out that the timing of exposure matters. So early exposure to wildfire smoke can actually lead to health impacts later in life. For example, a study of macaque monkeys housed in outdoor enclosures found that newborn monkeys exposed to wildfire smoke exhibited reduced lung capacity and weakened immune responses in adolescence compared to those born in a subsequent year with good air quality. So that suggests that an animal, maybe a bird, exposed to smoke very early in life is less likely to be healthy as an adolescent and into adulthood. So even a single exposure to smoke, particularly from a more extreme event, can have repercussions for a population for many, many years and generations to come. Furthermore, offspring of parents exposed to wildfire smoke may be less healthy than offspring born to parents without that stressor in play. And this is a connection made to the epidemiological literature, which has shown that there is an increased risk of preterm birth for women exposed to wildfire smoke during pregnancy. There is some really interesting and important research out there showing how women exposed to wildfire smoke during pregnancy are more likely to give birth too early, and that can lead to complications with their pregnancies, which is very devastating for families. So there's no reason to think that something similar wouldn't be in play for other animals. I have a question in the chat about increased mortality. Does this actually result in increased mortality? Do birds live long enough for this to affect them before they die of something else? That is a really good question. Unfortunately, there are very, very few studies linking wildfire smoke to vital rates, such as survivorship. So I have no way of knowing if these health impacts actually confer reduced resiliency for populations or have long-term impacts on population demographics. I certainly think that the longer a bird lives and the more exposure it has to smoke, that we would expect to see different results. But we could also expect that a single event might have catastrophic impacts. So I think that's a really important question, but one we can't really answer right now. And I'd be happy to dive into that more later on in the Q&A if there are still questions. So we know that animals are vulnerable to smoke, but which animals might be most vulnerable? Well, birds. Birds are likely more vulnerable than other terrestrial vertebrates to air pollution because they respire more efficiently than other air-breathing animals, including us. This means that they're able to extract more oxygen per unit volume of air inhaled than we do. So to visualize this, let's all take a deep breath. When we inhale, our lungs expand, which draws in fresh oxygenated air from our environment into our lungs. And when we exhale, our lungs contract, which expels air containing carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of respiration. That's how we breathe. Our lungs expand, we draw in fresh air, our lungs contract, we kick out that stale air and get rid of CO2. But this isn't how birds breathe at all. Birds actually have rigid lungs that don't expand or contract, and instead they use a system of air sacs to constantly push fresh air into and through their lungs. This unidirectional flow of air essentially maximizes the contact of that fresh air that's coming in with the gas exchange tissue. So they're able to extract more oxygen than we are every time they take a breath. And this adaptation is absolutely vital to the life of a bird because birds need huge amounts of oxygen to support the metabolic rates needed to fly. But this adaptation also makes birds more susceptible to toxic gases. Just as they're taking in more oxygen every time they breathe, they're also taking in more toxic gases. In addition, birds lack some of the mechanisms that mammals like us use to clear particles from their airways, which means that they are also more vulnerable to toxic particles. So for example, birds appear to have some type of cough-like action, but we're really not sure if it's effective at clearing debris, which is likely especially true for more long-necked birds like geese and swans that have very long trachea. When the trachea is longer or more rigid, a cough-like action might not be sufficient to actually clear debris from the airway. So when we think about birds being exposed to smoke, a simple cough, even if they can cough, and it's not clear that they really do cough, might be enough to kick out those particles and avoid exposure. Furthermore, birds have fewer of those janitorial cells, those macrophages that capture and destroy debris than mammals do. And in our bodies, that's like our primary line of defense. That's our primary way of getting rid of things that are dangerous to us in the respiratory system. So it's interesting that birds don't seem to have that same capacity. And finally, we're still learning more about this, but the ability for birds to secrete mucus and use that to get rid of debris in their airways is really unclear. So basically, birds breathe more efficiently than you and I do. They do this through unidirectional airflow, and they also seem to lack the mechanisms to clear particles. So whether we're talking about gas or particles in smoke, chances are they're more vulnerable to what they're breathing in during those events. We also found in this review that wildfire smoke is likely contributing to behavioral changes in birds and other wildlife. For example, some animals seem to reduce their activity, including movement and vocalization during during acute smoke events, and these effects may be long-term. For example, there is an ecoacoustics study that took place in Singapore during a haze event that occurred because of wildfires, which showed that these indices of acoustic activity and the presence and overall abundance of birds declined when it was smoky, and those levels did not rebound for months and months and months after the smoke event, which is a really interesting and important finding. Animals may also exhibit fire avoidance or energy conserving behaviors during a smoke event, which could suggest that smoke is serving as this trigger to make sure that an individual animal is not in harm's way when a fire has started. And finally, there are some animals like insects that actually exhibit these really interesting pyrophilous or fire-loving behaviors. For example, some insects are drawn to fire-killed trees, and it's possible that birds and bats following these insects may also be attracted to fire and smoke. So we use these findings from the review to create this conceptual model illustrating how the effects of wildfire smoke on the health or behavior of individuals could ultimately scale up to population and ecosystem level impacts. You can see at the bottom, we start with wildfire smoke. We discuss how this breaks down into gases and particulate matter contributing to health effects. And then we also consider how wildfire smoke contributes to behavioral responses. So this is all very exciting and interesting, but research to date is only providing us with this picture of what could be happening, not what really is happening. It's all very theoretical. And what we really need is inference on the impacts in wild, free-living animals and the sensitivity of responses to specific air pollutants. We really don't have a lot of research on exactly what birds and other wildlife are being exposed to in the wild, like what specific air pollutants at what concentrations, and we're not linking those to the responses that we observe. We lack these measurements, and so it's difficult to build dose-response relationships for vital rates, including survival, growth, and reproduction. So going back to that question from earlier on in the webinar, if we want to know the risk that smoke poses to population demographics, we really need to understand for individual species how air pollutants during smoke events contribute to shaping these vital rates. And so that's what I hope some of my research as a postdoc will allow us to get at. We also need to characterize behavioral responses to smoke, including movement and migration, so we can better understand any sort of innate capacity that birds have to avoid exposure to extreme smoke. And so I'm hoping to get at that as well in my postdoc. So to advance this research agenda, I think it's valuable to start by asking a much simpler question, which is just how does wildfire smoke affect detection of birds? Or in other words, how do our observations of birds change under different air quality conditions? If there is a difference in our ability to detect birds when it is smoky compared to when the air is clear, that tells us something about how smoke is affecting the health and behavior of birds and could suggest which species and communities are most at risk. So as a doctoral researcher at the University of Washington, as part of my dissertation, I led an analysis to answer this seemingly simple question and help us better understand where to start in all of this. Simply put, I asked, does wildfire smoke impact the probability of observing birds? And more specifically, I investigated how PM 2.5 during the wildfire season, which I defined as July through September for this study, affect the probability of observing birds in Washington state. This was our hypothesis. If wildfire smoke contributes to behavioral changes in birds, then that would lead to differences in their presence and detection. Maybe birds aren't in the same place when it's smoky, or maybe they change their behavior in a way that makes them less likely to be detected. For example, maybe they're not singing as much. Either way, that would influence our probability of observing birds, whether they're there or not, or whether they're singing or not, ultimately impacts whether or not they are detected. PM 2.5 is a marker of wildfire smoke. So we used data on PM 2.5 to test this relationship between smoke and the probability of observing birds. For this study, we relied on citizen science data from a very popular platform I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, called eBird, which is a global citizen science program run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that supports opportunistic data collection by volunteers, document the bird sightings that they experience in nature. So for this particular project, we relied on 62,908 checklists submitted to eBird from a whopping total of 4,865 observers, all of which are marked as gray dots on this map of Washington state. That's a lot of eBird checklists. Then we linked those checklists to data on PM 2.5 from 71 air quality monitors run by the Environmental Protection Agency, and those are shown as black triangles on the map. We also pulled in data on land cover from the 2016 National Land Cover Database to account for differences in habitat that might influence our probability of detecting birds, as well as data on weather from the North American Regional Reanalysis. We know that air temperature and precipitation also influences bird behavior, so we wanted to account for that as well. Ultimately, we analyzed 71 species that were commonly observed in the year 2015 across the state of Washington, and then we modeled the probability of observing each of those species during the 2015 through 2018 fire seasons. It's important to think about the probability of observing a bird as the result of two processes. There's that probability of presence, the probability that a bird is using a habitat or is found in a place. And then there's the probability of detecting a bird given presence. We all know that when we go out to observe the birds, even in our own backyards, we don't expect to see the same species day in and day out. Birds move throughout their territory or their home range, and some days they're more or less active as they meet their foraging needs and carry out tasks and activities that make up their life history. So detection is not a perfect process. And so our probability of observing a bird on any given day reflects both this probability that they're there and the probability that we're able to detect them. And that's what this study really got into. So we accounted for year, land cover class, day of year, time of day, survey duration, distance traveled, temperature, precipitation, and PM 2.5, as well as observability, and thought, okay, after accounting for all of this, what is the effect of PM 2.5? And what does that tell us about how smoke influences detection of birds? We found that PM 2.5 during the fire season influenced the probability of observing 37% of study species, including raptors, water birds, and songbirds. So across taxa, we observed a relationship between smoke and the probability of observing birds across Washington state. This relationship was negative for 16 species and positive for 10 species, which suggests that what we found can't be explained just by impacts on human observers alone. Wildfire smoke could certainly impair a birder's ability, a birder's observational skills. Smoke could make one feel sick or limit visibility. There are many reasons why a smoky day might be a day that is more challenging for birders. But I can't think of any reason why a birder would suddenly get better at birding and see their observational skills enhanced when it is smoky. Therefore, if the probability of observing birds was driven only by changes in our ability to observe birds and observer ability, we wouldn't expect to find a positive relationship of PM 2.5 for any species. So because we found that some species were actually more readily detected as PM 2.5 increased, we believe that our results suggest that at least some species must exhibit behavioral changes during smoke events that make them easier to detect or move into areas that are smoky. So altogether, this suggests that even though there's certainly a possibility that because of limitations in visibility or because of our own feelings of sickness during a smoke event, we might be worse at birding, our results suggest that birds are actually changing their behavior during smoke events that make them more or less likely to be detected. This is a plot showing some of our results, where the y-axis shows the predicted probability of observing birds and the x-axis shows the daily mean concentration of PM 2.5. And this plot includes species we observed a positive relationship between these variables. So species where the probability of observing individuals increased as smoke intensified. We found that PM 2.5 increased the probability of observing 10 species, including cedar waxwing, red-breasted nuthatch, spotted towhee, western tanager, and several species of warblers. This list includes many small songbirds and birds that are spotted at ground level. And while the mechanisms driving this relationship were beyond the scope of our study, our results point to several interesting hypotheses. For example, a lot of species that exhibited this positive relationship, such as warblers, are often spotted on the upper branches of trees, which made us think that if reduced visibility during smoke events actually forces these species closer to the ground, they may be more easily detected by birders. It's also possible that when it's hazy and visibility is limited, birders might actually focus their observations more intently on the smaller species that are right in their immediate view, as opposed to looking out or up, where it would be harder to observe birds when it's hazy. This plot shows the relationship between the predicted probability of observing birds and smoke for those that we were less likely to observe as smoke intensified, which included 16 species, including many water birds, as well as raptors, such as the turkey vulture and red-tailed hawk. This list includes many water birds and raptors, and these birds are likely spotted at farther distances most of the time. Those are birds that we don't necessarily see up close, but that we spot at far distances. So one possible reason for this relationship is that visibility is limited during smoke events, and so it's harder to observe those birds that we typically spot from much farther away. I also think it's interesting to think about how raptors might be impacted by limited visibility. If they typically hunt at high altitudes and they can no longer see all the way to the ground because it's smoky, maybe they leave. Maybe they're just like, yeah, this is not where I want to be. I don't have enough food. And they are able to do that because they have larger home ranges. This would also lend to an interesting hypothesis about predator-prey interactions. So if these larger raptor species are getting out of there when it's smoky because they can't see to the ground and hunting is hard, maybe that reduces pressure on some of these smaller songbirds that we're actually detecting more often when it's smoky. So there's a lot to dig into here. I think one of the most exciting results from the study, though, is a comparison of effect sizes. So as I said, we counted for a lot of things that are likely to influence detection of birds. For example, the longer you're out conducting surveys, the longer you're out documenting bird sightings for eBird, the more likely it is that you will observe birds. And we see that in our result. If you scan over to the fourth variable in this plot, duration, you see that that's always a positive effect, even if it's not necessarily statistically significant. So that suggests that if you bird longer, you are more likely to observe all 71 of these species. However, the effect of PM2.5, which again has been largely discounted in scientific literature, actually is greater than the effect of rainfall and temperature, which are variables that we very often consider as birders as having an influence on our ability to detect birds. For example, detection of spotted towhees was positively related to PM2.5, whereas the effects of both temperature and precipitation were not significant. So that suggests that really excluding air pollution leads to bias in our studies of bird populations, and is really something for birders to think about when planning their day and thinking about what birds they want to see. So while we did not make any direct observations of the health or behavior of birds in this study, these patterns are really helpful in starting to parse out avian responses to smoke across taxa. What this study shows is that smoke is influencing the presence, availability, and or perceptibility of birds. And maybe I can't tease that out, but there's something there that's worth digging into. And these differences are likely explained in part by species-specific behavioral responses. And these patterns can help guide future study by telling us where to look next. And they also, as I mentioned, point out that when we're modeling population demographics and we're thinking about risks to birds, we really need to be thinking about air pollution. I've also considered how PM2.5 affects the detectability of birds in an entirely different context. So rather than studying PM2.5 as a measure of smoke intensity, I considered daily variation in urban PM2.5 in cities, where notable sources of this pollutant include vehicle exhaust, industrial emissions, and wood burning. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns, I launched a community science project that focused on cities in the Pacific Northwest. The goal was to establish a data collection campaign through eBird to monitor birds in cities under lockdown in the spring of 2020. And I invited volunteers to help with this endeavor by filling out an eBird checklist for a specific point count that they could complete, ideally on a weekly basis, but possibly more often. And the point count was a complete stationary 10-minute point count at a monitoring site of their choosing. We collected data from April 1st through June 30th, and more than 900 people enrolled in this study, which is mind-boggling and fascinating and amazing, and just is a testament to how incredible the birding community is and how dedicated the birding community is to avian conservation. So with the results of this study, with these checklists that we collected, I built a series of models to look at specifically how human activity and other aspects of cities influence the probability of detecting birds. And we found that after accounting for seasonality, time of day, weather, and changes in vehicle traffic, day-to-day changes in air quality affected the detectability of about 1/5 of our study species. And what's even more interesting about this is that during COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns in the Pacific Northwest, air quality was very good. It certainly met public health standards. And so that suggests that even when the air quality is deemed safe for human health, air pollution might still be driving species-specific behavioral changes in birds that ultimately affect whether or not we observe them. So as PM2.5 increased, we found that northern flickers, Eurasian collared doves, house sparrows, mourning doves, and orange-crowned warblers were all less likely to be detected, while dark-eyed juncos, chestnut-backed chickadees, golden-crowned kinglets, mallards, and violet-green swallows were more likely to be detected. And it's important to remember that in this case, PM2.5 is largely from different sources and is all within what's considered to be a good air quality range. But it's still fascinating to think about how these results compare to what we found previously in our studies of wildfire smoke impacts on observations. This study really reaffirmed that air pollution is an important component of the detection process in multiple contexts and demonstrates the power of community science to study air pollution impacts on birds. So looking ahead, I have a lot of ideas for what I'd like to explore in my postdoc. I'm interested in exploring impacts of wildfire smoke on the distribution and movement of birds. And I'm also interested in linking bird observations from long-term monitoring and community science programs with data on air quality. I think we actually already have a lot of the data that we need to answer this research question. Atmospheric scientists have amazing tools to estimate air pollution, and ecologists have an abundance of data at the ready to quantify shifts in bird behavior and species distributions. And what we need is an opportunity and interdisciplinary expertise to link those resources together. And that's what I hope to do. My goals are really to assess the potential for smoke to act as an ecological disturbance that exists with, alongside, and separate from fire. So where there's fire, there's smoke, and animals experience fire and smoke simultaneously in some places at some times, but they also sometimes just experience the smoke part. And I think digging into that is really interesting and will be incredibly valuable for conservation in the age of megafires when we see these more extreme smoke events take place on the landscape. I also hope through my research that I'll be able to identify which species of birds are most vulnerable to smoke. We know that birds are more vulnerable than other taxa, than other terrestrial vertebrates because they breathe so efficiently. But even within that, there is likely to be differences in vulnerability based on size and metabolic rate and life history strategy, and identifying which functional traits confer resiliency and which confer vulnerability can help inform climate change vulnerability assessments and help us understand how to best support birds when it's smoky. I also want to determine the air pollution thresholds above which impacts on avian health and behavior may occur. Maybe there is a level of PM 2.5 that's actually okay. That's not too bad for birds. And maybe there's a level above which is really, really bad. So understanding those critical thresholds, I think from a policy perspective, will be very valuable. Some big picture goals. So we've talked a lot in this seminar about detection. And detection is a complicated process that reflects things that are happening simultaneously. So first, a bird has to be present. It has to occur in a landscape and use a site where you are at the time that you are birding in order for you to see it. If it's not there, you're never going to see it. It also has to be there in the moment that you're there. It has to be visible. It has to be calling. It needs to be available to be detected. And then you have to notice it. And so teasing out when we see these relationships between smoke and detection, what does that really mean? Which of these three components of detectability is driving that relationship? I hope to take my research to the next level in my postdoc and really dig into this. I also want to start considering state transition. So I want to understand how smoke causes birds to move into and out of landscapes. And I want to compare and contrast responses across taxa and ecoregions and habitats and migratory status and really better understand that vulnerability. I think it will be valuable to also think about other air pollutants. PM 2.5 is a major component of smoke, and from a public health standpoint, that's the most important pollutant when we're talking about smoke impacts. But there's a lot of other stuff in smoke that could be influencing birds, such as carbon monoxide or mercury, and digging into that will be valuable as well. It may also be important to consider lag times. Going back to that first question a viewer asked, we may not know if a single smoke event has these multi-generational effects or leads to shifts in population demographics right now, but I hope that my research can get into that and consider different lag times of exposure. So does one exposure matter? Does exposure 6 weeks ago matter? Does exposure last year matter to this year? Or for some birds, is their lifetime so short that maybe the lag times aren't as big of a deal? So that's going to be an avenue moving forward. And finally, I hope to develop and investigate some of these mechanistic hypotheses driving bird behavior. So transitioning a bit to how you can all help. So when we're talking about a new stressor in a place where birds live, the best thing we can do is provide them support year round and avoid other stressors. So when it's smoky, it would be great if folks could help support wildlife rehab organizations, be prepared to call in sightings of animals that have been injured by fire or seem to be suffering from smoke inhalation. Think about providing supplementary food and water so that animals moving through trying to escape a fire and smoke event have resources available to them. And consider volunteering at a wildlife rehab organization that might be trying to save animals that are suffering during these really extreme fire and smoke events that they just haven't adapted to deal with. But aside from that, there are lots of things to do to support our local bird populations. We can certainly support efforts to protect existing wildlife habitat by contacting our elected officials or writing an op-ed or letter to the editor and really making our voice heard. We can also advocate for wildlife corridors. This is good whether or not we're talking about fire and smoke. It's good for animals to have safe places to move from one habitat to the next. You can also transform your backyard into an oasis by planting native species and creating spaces for animals to shelter. Who knows, maybe when it's smoky, your backyard would be the place they turn to. As always, it's really important to keep your pets indoors or on a leash. As an animal is escaping a fire and smoke event, it would be a shame if they encountered an invasive species along their route that made it harder for them to survive. And as always, we can reduce our carbon footprint so that we are collectively contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and addressing climate change, which is one of the primary factors in driving these megafires. And of course, you can participate in wildlife survey efforts like eBird, which help us all collect fabulous data that can be used to fuel studies just like this. So with that, I would like to thank my co-authors, mentors, and all the fabulous citizen scientists who contribute to eBird, and note that my research is supported by a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, as well as the McIntyre Stennis Cooperative Forestry Research Program. I am currently a postdoc at the UCLA Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and within that, the Global Change Ecology Lab. And I thank all of my lab mates and my advisor for the support that they have provided for my research to date. And if anybody has any questions, I would love to take them. I have all night. We can go back and talk about bird biology or dive into statistics or talk about ongoing projects, whatever you are all interested in. Thank you so much for your attention and your interest. And I'm excited to chat more in the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. And it's so fascinating to hear about the importance that eBird has played in a lot of your research.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone and their mother on this list, on this attendees list, probably is an eBirder, but there are lots of significant birders that aren't, and so we need to convert everyone.
Yes, and I do get it. I must admit that I'm not an avid eBirder. I do submit eBird checklists, but not every time I go birding. Possibly because I spend a lot of my day looking at eBird checklists, so it doesn't feel as much like fun. But also I can understand why somebody maybe doesn't want to pause that in that time of tranquility to collect that data. But even if you were to submit one eBird checklist a week or consider eBirding in different places, or providing consistent observations from your backyard, that would be a tremendous contribution to the database.
Well, and eBird has become so much easier than the early days. All you need now is a quick smartphone and you're eBirding without even thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I had a question while we were waiting for other questions to pop up. PM2 2.5, as the particulate, it's not, can you have that particulate without having smoke? And
Yeah. So PM 2.5 is as a size class of particulate matter. So
right.
particulate matter in general is just suspended solid and liquid particles. So things that hover in the air that we can breathe in and enter our airway. And then we break up particulate matter into size categories. So 2.5 refers to the width of the particles in that size class. But PM2.5 has a lot of different sources. So you could
Right.
certainly encounter like what's in wildfire smoke and that particulate in other contexts. I mean, even just by lighting a fire in your home, like the same particulates can be an issue.
Right, which raises the next question. If PM 2.5 is leading to certain species becoming less visible or more visible, as the case may be, somehow birds must detect it.
Mm-hmm.
So birds smell it or feel it through their breathing apparatus and all that. Oh, by the
Yeah.
way, how do birds exhale?
Okay. This is great. Okay. I love both.
No, wait. Let me guess before you tell us.
Okay.
Do
I'll answer
birds
your
just
first question.
fart all the time? Okay.
Fortunately, it's a little more complicated than that.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so to answer your first question, there are a number of reasons why birds may be more or less readily detected as PM 2.5 increases, either in urban contexts or in the context of smoke events. So first, they might leave. They might just say, I don't want to be here. It is dangerous to be here. I'm going to head out. And that would suggest that they're either detecting the PM 2.5 possibly by picking up on odors and a change in the chemical cues of their environment, or they feel unwell, they feel unhealthy, and that triggers this response to get out of Dodge. I mean, if you walk outside during a smoke event, you can smell it and you also start to feel crummy and you want to go inside. So similarly, they either smell it or maybe feel sick and leave.
Sure.
But they also might not be able to leave or might not be willing to leave. And I think this is particularly interesting to think about when we consider how the fire season is getting earlier and earlier in California. So there's this potential for it to overlap with the breeding season, and birds that are actively breeding or caring for young way less likely to leave their nest and abandon their young, even if it's smoky, than a bird that is not responsible for parental care at that time, whether that be the adult male in certain species or birds that haven't started breeding yet or birds that are between broods. So there is a lot in play there as to whether or not a bird does leave. And if it doesn't leave and it's there, you still might not detect it because it could be hunkering down to avoid the smoke. It could be reducing its energy, kind of just like hunkering down. There's this really interesting study looking at orangutans. And there's an orangutan follow study during a smoke event, and the orangutans just kind of hung out. They reduced their distance traveled. They didn't forage, they just kind of waited until the smoke left, and something similar could be happening in birds. As far as the breathing question goes, so how do I do this quickly? So birds have rigid lungs that sit in their chest cavity, and the lungs are surrounded by a system of air sacs, and they all have very specific names based on their position within the body, but generally speaking, there is a group of them at the front called the anterior air sacs and a group at the back, or the posterior air sacs. So avian respiration takes place in 4 steps. So first, the air is pulled in through the nares at the base of the bill, down the trachea, and actually to the back of the lungs, to those posterior air sacs. That's inhale 1. Then on the exhale, so when the rib cage compresses and the air sacs decrease in volume as a result of that pressure, the air that's held in the posterior air sacs is pushed through into the lungs, and that's where gas exchange takes place. Then on the second inhale, as the rib cage opens and those air sacs inflate again, that stale air that's been processed in the lungs is pulled into the front air sacs. And then on the last exhale, that air is pushed out. The trick is that the inhale steps happen at the same time. So just as air is being pulled from the lungs into the anterior air sacs, fresh air is being pulled into the back air sacs. And so the birds are still breathing in and out like we do, but the process of respiration is taking place in these 4 steps. And so their air is kicked out just like our air is kicked out at the top of their trachea, but it has gone through a loop. It's gone through 4 steps instead of 2.
And
Very cool.
very
Mhm,
cool.
isn't
And
it?
while we're working on breathing, some really good questions came through, Mark.
Yes.
Take a deep
Okay,
breath
great.
and why don't you get into
Takes a
it?
deep breath, and there's some questions. Alicia, and I'm going to read the questions because
Okay.
people on the YouTube don't see the question. So,
Okay.
Alicia asks, how do you control for the way PM 2.5 affects the food supply for birds? Is that what land cover is a proxy for?
Awesome question, Alicia. So we definitely need to account for habitat at the time of a smoke event, which is why we pulled in land cover. I do not think that covariate would account for any impacts of PM 2.5 on the availability of food resources, mostly because I expect that availability wouldn't be reflected just in the vegetation and land use that particular variable that we pulled in really stands for. So when we pull in data on land cover, we have different classes like developed or forested or grassland. And while PM 2.5 acute or chronic deposition of particles from the air onto vegetation and sediments could certainly change land cover, I don't think it would happen quickly. It's not going to happen on this day-to-day scale, and we're looking at detection on a day-to-day basis. So we're really just getting a snapshot of what the vegetation and extent of the built environment look like where an eBird checklist was documented, and then adding in what was in the air at that time. Now, there is this possibility that PM 2.5 could influence, for example, like relative abundance of insects, and that could affect the detectability of birds. But that's sort of captured in that effect of PM 2.5. So the effect that we observe could be due to inhalation exposure and subsequent health impacts, possibly mortality during very extreme events, but it could also be resulting in these indirect effects. So we're still picking them up, but we can't necessarily tease them out. Let me know if you have any more questions about that. That was a really good question. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You the next question.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned before consistent eBird data, and Ken asks, what does consistent eBird data mean?
Sure. So it can be so tempting to just keep an eBird checklist while we travel from point A to point B on a hike or a nature walk, because that's fun. We get to move around and really search for a species of interest to us. And I'm totally not saying don't do that, because that brings us joy, and that is a valuable data type that can be used for different kinds of analyses. If you can, it is better to do a stationary count. Ideally short counts of maybe 10 to 15 minutes captured in an eBird checklist give us a little bit more confidence in really feeling like the detection of all birds in that place at that time have been documented. And if you were to do that in the same place week to week or month to month, that would give us this running checklist of birds that are seen in that area, and we could compare surveys day to day, week to week, month to month, and really think about how air pollution is affecting what we see. If we don't have eBird from the same places at the same times, it can be harder to include those places in our analyses. So sometimes where we really want to think about smoke impacts, we don't necessarily have eBird checklists that are comparable. So one of the things you can do is really think about contributing the more informative eBird checklists, which from an ecological modeling perspective is a stationary count, a stationary complete count, documenting all the birds you can see and hear during your survey, and ideally keeping it to, I would say, at least 10, maybe 10 to 20 minutes, because longer than that, things are changing very quickly. It's less of a snapshot, and you also might not be capturing all the birds despite your best intention.
And to continue that observation even during the event.
Mm-hmm.
And not, the fire or the, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And on that note, I certainly can't ask anybody to bird when it is smoky. Do not do that. Do not do that if that makes you uncomfortable. I do not advocate for that. If you are comfortable birding when it is smoky, it would be very valuable to have your observations. And one thing that you could do to keep yourself safe is wear an N95 mask, which many of us have following the COVID-19 pandemic. That will drastically limit your exposure to PM 2.5. And I could be wrong. And if there's an MD on this call who would like to correct me, please let me know. But I think a 10 to 20 minute eBird count while wearing your N95 in smoke is unlikely to pose a major risk to you and your person. Don't do it if it makes you feel uncomfortable. Certainly those with pre-existing conditions might not want to risk it at all. And I absolutely respect and appreciate that. But if you can do that, it would be great to have your data.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have a question from, let's see, we have Alicia, so we have one from Carol. Carol asks, in the 60s, research in national parks showed that fires occurred about every 5 years. That research stated we should manage duff, but most national parks have suppressed fires. Has this resulted in major fires that damage the forest more dramatically? What do you suspect how this has affected bird behavior or genetic results?
Great question. So I don't specifically know the policies around managing duff, but I do know that for a very long time, the Forest Service and generally land management agencies at the state and federal level did have a policy of fire suppression for many decades. Fire was perceived to be bad. We wanted to put fires out. We did not understand the role that they played as an ecological disturbance, particularly in ecosystems that are prone to low intensity but frequent fires like dry coniferous forests, where that fire plays a really important role in clearing out the underbrush and creating an open canopy. And so by suppressing those fires, we've seen a huge buildup of vegetation, and we've seen canopies close and understories grow. And that is actually going to lead to more wildfire activity because there's just more to burn. It's not possible to light a match and not catch something. So if you'd had that more open understory, chances are the fire would be much smaller. It would not reach the crown of trees. It would stay close to the surface level. It would be it would be less hot and it would be less smoky. That's the kind of fires that we used to have in a lot of these ecosystems. And that's not to say that big fires didn't happen. They totally did, both in like scale and intensity. But those were rarer events. And what we're seeing now is certainly partially related to fire suppression, but it's made worse by climate change because as it gets hotter and drier, those fuels dry out. And so now you have this understory that's just ripe for a fire. So California is actually investing a lot of effort into putting fire back on the landscape. And that's a really important management strategy that we're going to be seeing. I know there's been a lot of work done to work with indigenous communities and consider the value of cultural burning practices and really provide opportunities for those as well.
Great.
So I have a question for you. What about duration of smoke events? You know, some are relatively short, and some, like the ones up north in 2020, lasted for a long time. Did you account for that in any of what you've done, and what would you hypothesize would happen when things get longer and smoky and they last for weeks on end?
Yeah. So in the work that I've done so far, we have accounted for differences in year to year. But that is primarily in effect that represents changes in bird populations more generally. So we all know that like some years are good for birds and some years aren't so good for birds. And some years we have eruptions and some years we don't. And sometimes we might not know why. And so by including a year effect in our models, we can kind of absorb some of that variation, but we don't necessarily know why one year is different from the other. So I'm sure that my models do get at some of that effect, that 2020 would have been a really bad year versus 2015, which was a less bad year for smoke. But generally speaking, the approach that I've taken is really thinking about smoke on a day-to-day basis. So how is the smoke today? And how is that influencing our observations of birds today? Not so much thinking, has this cumulative exposure of smoke for weeks on end influenced detection? I am thinking about that in my postdoc. So I'm very excited to start considering how exposure at different lag times and acute versus chronic exposure is influencing birds. There was a second part of your question, Frank, that I have forgotten.
No, I think that was the main,
Okay.
you got to the main gist of it.
Okay.
The other question I had, part two, was what makes a good eBird checklist for the type of research you're doing? What information besides the usual species and numbers, time, duration? I mean, is there other annotation or other things that would be helpful for your specific type of research?
If you're birding when it's smoky, you want to write smoke in the comments. That would be very helpful, because sometimes I parse the comments to see who's birding when it's smoky. You're also welcome to add any sort of behaviors that to you seem unusual. You can also email me if you see something in the field that you think is interesting in the context of smoke impacts. That I can't necessarily say, oh, yes, what you're seeing is due to smoke, because I won't know that. But if lots of people report this, that gives me an idea of what to expect, and I can design studies around your anecdotes. So in the past, for example, folks have emailed me or written in eBird checklists that a place that they typically go birding at feels eerily silent when it's smoky. That's a phrase I hear a lot. It's eerie, it's silent. Why is that? Well, I don't know. And I don't know that the birds aren't there or aren't singing, but it's very interesting and very important that somebody who goes birding in the same place all the time has suddenly seen this shift in their birding community. That's a valuable observation, and that helps me think through what my hypotheses are and what I want to test next. So definitely don't be afraid to add comments. It's just that comment alone might not be enough to solve this problem, but if you get lots of comments together across all these checklists, we can come closer to finding the truth.
So putting in your comments the fact that you feel that there's a lot of PM 2.5 in the air really wouldn't help you, or would help you. No, I'm just kidding. Don't worry.
You could definitely, like, if you okay, so for example, I'll just share an anecdote. So when we were trying to publish that study that I presented on impacts on detectability in Washington State, one major concern that the reviewers had, which was completely understandable, was whether or not the frequency of eBird checklists, so the availability of data, was influenced by smoke, and whether or not people were actually observing smoke conditions where they were birding, because we were using data from the nearest air quality monitor, and it added a threshold distance, so you couldn't be further from, I think, 32 kilometers from an air quality monitor. But that doesn't mean that it was necessarily absolutely definitely smoky where you were. It was. It's pretty close, but it's not a guarantee. Smoke moves quickly and it changes rapidly in space and time. So first, we ran a number of statistical tests to look at the number of eBird checklists as it related to smoke pollution on a given day. We did not find any evidence that people don't go birding when it's smoky. We don't have a lot of days when it's smoky, so we don't have a lot of eBird checklists from the craziest, smokiest days, because they're not super common. But as far as a relationship between the two, I have not seen evidence of that. But that study included 2015 to 2018, not a year like 2020. And imagine in a year like 2020, people are not birding when they can't, see more than 100 feet out their front door. Yeah. So certainly, in the future, I expect to run into an issue of data availability when I start including years like 2020 in my analyses. Right. Second of all, we told the reviewers that there were X number of checklists that talked about how smoky it was as proof that people were outside birding when it was smoky. So if you even just write it was smoky today or smoky, I will find that and I can use it at least to demonstrate some on the ground anecdotes that support what we're seeing in our models.
Very important, very important.
So we have another question by James Zimmer. To estimate smoke as a field observer, reported as see trees at 100 yards or 1/4 mile, etc. Should we report it like that on the eBird list?
If you'd like to, that would certainly be valuable to me as a scientist reading through your comments. I I think it would be really hard to standardize that across volunteers. So I don't know that I could use that as like a variable, but there are some really great visibility products offered by like NASA, for example, that I could certainly use. And so it would be great to have that on a subset of checklists. So I could say, okay, this visibility product, NASA's using satellite data. They think visibility should be X. And then I could look at eBird checklist and see if you all agree. And if you don't, that might suggest that I need to use like a finer spatial resolution in my models. So again, it's really about ground truthing, but certainly like how far you can see, like if it smelled like smoke versus it was just cloudy, because sometimes people, when it's been smoky, assume that like on a cloudy day, it's still smoky. And that makes sense because it's darker and you've been in this dark, hazy environment. So you're like, oh, it's still smoky. But use like all your senses. How far can you see? What are you smelling? Does the air feel grimy? Can you see ash? Really think about whether or not it's smoky. You could also, if you wanted, if you have an iPhone, you can report the air quality index from the weather app on your phone. So you can literally look that up and be like, oh, at the time that I was birding, the AQI was 151. And you could just add that to your checklist. So all of those would be valuable, but there's also no pressure. Like at the end of the day, what I really need from a science perspective is lots of eBird data. So if you don't want to take the time to fill that out, totally understand. Just submit your 10-minute point count and go on with your day.
Sounds good.
Wonderful.
Mark, what is that that website that gives you all the relevant weather information to pop into your eBird? I know Andy used it. Andy, are you on this call? I don't see you.
Let's see, Andy.
I think it's Rain Crow.
Okay.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
Rain
that
Crow.
sounds kind of familiar. So, Frank, is it raincrow.com? I know I'm
Now
looking
everybody's
up right now
Googling
also.
rain crow.
I don't know that it has anything on fire or air pollution. It's mostly just cloud cover and temperature. And
Yeah. That would be interesting. Do you know what I'm talking about, Olivia? It's like weather.com or whatever that gives you all the relevant weather information for your location per your
Right,
per your phone.
but it's a past thing. So you type in an eBird checklist. eBird checklist has a number at the end. S blah 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 blah. You type that into Rain Crow, and it will tell you what the weather was
Oh,
at that
very cool.
location. When
But
you made your
But I
observation.
wonder if it also, if it's relevant, gives you pollen and pollution and air quality. And that was what I was
That I
getting.
don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely worth looking into. That would be very interesting. But certainly, like, you could just write smoke, and I would have it would be
Keep
fine.
it simple. Okay, I
Yeah.
understand.
It was also I mean I could probably pretty easily like use somebody's GPS coordinates and extract this at a meaningful scale. So it's more like for
Right.
me to read through the comments when I'm starting my analysis to get a sense for what people were seeing, and ground truthing.
Okay, and Alicia just popped up. She uses something called Purple Air. Okay, then. Oh, it's raincrow.netlify.app. Oh, it's an app. Okay.
Netlify. Yeah. Or Netlify. Okay.
So Alicia, Purple Air, love Purple Air. So for those who
Okay.
don't know,
Purple Air. I
Air
don't know
is
Purple
I
Purple Air
don't know.
is a private company that sells low-cost air quality sensors that are increasingly used in epidemiological and ecological studies because they are cost-effective, and you can buy many more sensors than you could if you were buying a more high-quality, rigorous tool. Now, there are some caveats. First of all, Purple Air does have some measurement biases that need to be accounted for, but the EPA has been so interested in the data that can be obtained from this network that they have developed some conversion equations that are easy to apply. So that's good. And there's been a lot more investment in comparing the performance of those sensors to the performance of the gold standard units that are used for national public health applications. There is a very uneven distribution of purple areas in the country, but folks are increasingly invested in them. If you're interested, I think a sensor costs about $200 and you can put it outside your home, and then you will have real-time recordings of the air quality in your backyard. They will be updated every minute, and you can access the data anytime from a mobile application. They also, the company posts all of the data from sensors that have gone public onto a map. So if you go to purpleair.com, you can load their map and you can see in real time the readings from sensors all across the country, and they're color coded to represent the relationship between the measurements and air quality standards. So a green monitor is one that's meeting health-based standards and a red is exceeding it. I plan to use data from Purple Air in some of my analyses that are focused on cities. That's where we have a lot of good purple air data, but we'll still have to think about where we have gaps in that network. So that's another thing to think about. I hesitate to ask people to do something like that because it requires a personal investment. It's just like, Project Feeder Watch costs $15 to enroll. And I have reservations about asking anybody to volunteer when it costs money. I don't think that's fair. But if you personally are interested in your air quality and you bought one, you could read your air quality at any time. That could be cool for you and your family if that's something that you want to track.
And Alicia mentioned that 2 people on her block have those monitors, and so you're able to keep. Wonderful. Mark, I think we're running out of questions.
Yes, I think we are.
Well, thank you very much, Olivia. That was really a great talk. Very, very informative, thought-provoking.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it.
Yes, it was fantastic.
Excellent.
We have another question. We do have another question.
Whoa.
Yes, from Britta. I'm in the Anza-Borrego Desert below Julian, and I've noticed that the last few years, CAL FIRE seems to ignite its controlled prescribed burns during the spring migration. Do you think there's any chance of encouraging them to start earlier?
Okay, that's a really good question. So first of all, I just want to make a huge disclaimer that I am not in forest management, and the folks in forest management have quite a task. So certainly if you have experience, professional or volunteer in forest management, and you disagree with what I have to say on this, please share it with me because I'm interested in learning more about forest management policies.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're thinking about planning prescribed burns, we're managing a lot of different needs. So the primary purpose is to put fire back in the landscape and to clear out understory, open up those forest and grassland ecosystems, and really simulate what a low intensity but frequent burn would have looked like in an ecosystem that would have been allowed to have that fire for the past decades and centuries. It also lowers fire risk because, as I was saying earlier, if we have too much fuel built up in a system and a fire comes through, that's ready to ignite, and then the energy from that fire can quickly spill over and get out of control, and suddenly you have a megafire, a crown fire that's moving very quickly and is difficult to rein in. So from both an ecosystem resiliency standpoint and a wildfire mitigation standpoint, prescribed fire is an excellent tool for really supporting healthy ecosystems. Now, you can't start prescribed burns too early because the ground can't be frozen. And you can't do them too late because then you are running into the risk of harming wildlife populations as they move further north during spring migration, as well as potentially burning when you now have a risk of fire happening, which is starting to happen earlier and earlier each year. So I don't envy anybody who's trying to make these complicated decisions. I am planning a few studies, hopefully in collaboration with the Forest Service, to look at bird behavior during prescribed burns and really understand how they respond to smoke events, so that we can get some good data. And hopefully, if there's something we could do to reduce risks to birds during migration and breeding when prescribed burns take place in the spring, we know what that looks like and we can implement those policies. But in the meantime, I guess I would say that I'm not super concerned about having too many prescribed burns. I'm actually worried we're not doing enough burning, because when we're not allowing fire to take place on landscape, we run the risk of megafires. The smoke from those megafires is hugely problematic. It leads to thousands of deaths of people every year, and the consequences for wildlife are likely to be quite high, in my opinion, even if we don't know what they are yet.
Yeah, and I presume the justification for those burns is available to anyone in the public to take a look at.
Yeah, and I would encourage you, if you have concerns about specific burns in your area, particularly if you bird in an area quite frequently, contact your local Forest Service representatives. I happen to have a colleague in Oregon who was monitoring an owl nest near her property, and she knew that a prescribed burn was being planned, and that made her very nervous. And so she was able to work with the agency leading that burn, so that they were more than 100 feet away from the nest. So just an example, like, I mean, our agency scientists can't be everywhere, and so they actually need you to let them know if there's a problem, if they're not aware of it. They do their best, but this is why I think community science is so powerful, because the more folks we have on the ground, the more likely it is that we're going to make good decisions.
Agreed. Well, Olivia, as Frank and as Marcus have said, thank you very much for a wonderful webinar tonight. We really, really appreciate it. Everyone out there, I hope to see everyone on the boat for our next pelagic trip this Saturday, isn't it? Or Sunday? Can't remember, Mark. Oh, this weekend. Okay.
Saturday.
Okay, it's Saturday. And next Tuesday, Julian Hoff will be back for part 2 of Jaegers. I'm looking forward to that also. And thank you all very much. And thank you again, Olivia. I really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, Olivia.
Have a lovely evening.
You too.
You too.
Thank
Thanks
you.
You
again.
too.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone. Thanks
night.
again.